The entire auditorium fell silent as Mr. Halden ripped Elijah's solution in half on stage, calling it math theater, unworthy of real competition. Cameras flashed, students laughed, and Elijah, the only black finalist, just stood there shaking, silent, humiliated. But seconds later, a stunned judge snatched the torn page from the trash, and her eyes froze. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as Elijah Carter stepped off the elevator and into the beige-toned prep hallway of the State Academic Convention Center. The scent of freshly printed papers, stale coffee, and institutional carpet hung thick in the air. His duffel bag thumped against his hip with each nervous stride. He tightened his grip on the strap, heart tapping a rhythm against his ribs, not from fear of math, but from what he already felt crawling beneath the surface of the room ahead. As he rounded the corner toward the assigned prep suite for the Northridge math team, the hum of quiet conversation hushed. 6 students in tailored blazers and pressed slacks stood shoulder to shoulder, all of them white, all of them instantly freezing at the sight of him. A tall girl with ginger hair blinked, glancing at his hoodie and thrift store jeans. Someone near the door muttered, "Not quietly enough. Quota must have been real low this year." The words hit like sleet, sharp, cold, and quick to melt into the skin. Elijah didn't flinch. He'd heard worse, and from closer. He walked in anyway, head high, though his insides churned with that familiar blend of shame and fury. A shame he didn't earn, a fury he couldn't afford to show. Mr. Richard Halden stood at the whiteboard, marker in hand, drawing out a logic grid for warm-ups. He turned as Elijah entered. Halden was a tall man with silvering temples and the confident posture of someone who hadn't been challenged in decades. His eyes narrowed for half a second, just long enough to notice Elijah's skin tone, his clothes, the fact that he didn't carry the laminated binder the other students clutched. "Oh," Halden said flatly. "You made it." Elijah nodded. "I'm Elijah Carter. I know who you are." Halden's voice carried that clipped tone, reserved for reprimands or disappointments. "Well," he continued, turning to the others with a forced smile, "we'll keep Carter on the bench until the easy rounds are over." A burst of laughter. Not from all, but enough. The kind that wasn't meant to be funny, just loud. A few of the students looked away uncomfortably, but no one said anything. Elijah's throat tightened. The words weren't subtle. They didn't need to be. Halden had just announced to the room that Elijah was a liability, a filler, a placeholder for progress optics. And worse, he said it like it was policy. He walked slowly to the end of the prep table and sat alone, placing his notepad down. He didn't need laminated cheat sheets. He didn't need the approval of Halden or the nods of kids who'd grown up with private tutors and summer STEM camps. What he needed, what he'd always needed, was space to prove what his mind could do when no one was in the way. Across the room, Halden began assigning question sets, ignoring Elijah completely. "McCrae, you're running number theory. Lindsay, combinatorics. Chen, geometry. Stick to the formulas we drilled. No improvising. This is a competition, not an art show." Elijah kept his head down. He knew that tone. The way Halden emphasized improvising was a jab. He had seen Elijah's qualifying round, the one where he'd used a compressed symbolic method instead of the standard process. It was cleaner, faster, and unconventional, and apparently unwelcome. Outside the prep room, loudspeakers echoed announcements across the convention hall. Thousands of students buzzed around booths, exhibitions, and contest areas. The state math competition was one of the most elite academic gatherings in the country, live-streamed nationally for its championship rounds. Only the top schools got in. Northridge had placed top 5 3 years running. This was Halden's pride, his stage, and in his eyes Elijah Carter was a stain on it. As Halden ran mock problems with the others, Elijah scribbled solutions on his own. His mind moved like a knife, precise, calculating, cutting through complexity with grace, honed in silence. No one looked at his notes. No one asked him to share. He didn't offer. An hour passed. The team moved to the main floor. The stage was enormous, bright with spotlights, surrounded by judges, cameras, and rows of blinking scoreboards. The crowd rippled with excitement as students in formal wear took their seats. Elijah followed quietly behind the others, walking with the nervous focus of someone who knew the rules didn't bend for him. Halden leaned toward a volunteer at the registration desk. "Double-check the order," he said tersely. "Carter should be last, or scratched if possible." The woman frowned. "It's randomized. Drawn live. Holden's jaw stiffened. He's not prepared. The woman ignored him, pointing to the large digital wheel on the side monitor. Names will be drawn in 30 seconds. The team lined up backstage. Elijah stood at the end, deliberately spaced apart. He could feel the heat of the lights, the swell of tension. A part of him wondered if walking away now would hurt more than staying. And then the wheel spun. The crowd hushed as names flickered across the screen, rapid-fire suspenseful. One by one, names disappeared, until only 3 remained. Elijah looked up, not breathing. The wheel slowed. First it landed on McCrae. Cheers erupted. Then it moved again. It landed on Carter. A hush fell. Holden's face twisted. His head turned sharply toward the screen, then to Elijah. The moment was ice cold. Raw. Elijah's name echoed through the speakers, representing Northridge Academy. Elijah Carter. The lights hit him like a wall. His pulse slammed. He stepped forward, the world watching. Holden's words still ringing in his ears. Keep him on the bench until the easy rounds are over. But this wasn't the bench. This was round 1. Elijah's name gets randomly drawn for round 1, in front of a national audience. The stage lights washed across Elijah's face as he stepped toward the podium, each beam slicing through the velvet dark auditorium, like a spotlight in a courtroom. The atmosphere felt heavier than oxygen, thick with the weight of expectation, suspicion, and the quiet satisfaction of those already convinced he would fail. His shoes touched the edge of the taped mark on the stage floor, and the microphone hummed faintly as the judges adjusted their notepads. Behind him, the murmur of the crowd dissolved into that chilling silence that didn't feel respectful. It felt anticipatory, as if people were waiting to witness a public unraveling, rather than a competition of minds. From the reserved section near the judges' table, Mr. Holden leaned closer to a fellow coach, his voice lowered but sharp enough to slice through the hush. He whispered that Elijah would choke on something as basic as an integer proof. His words packaged in a chuckle that carried the cruel confidence of someone already writing the ending before the story began. Elijah didn't need to turn around to know Holden was smiling. He felt the smirk like a hand pressing down on his shoulders. The comment didn't surprise him. What surprised him was how easily others around Holden accepted it. Not shocked, not uncomfortable, but silently agreeing as if his failure had already been rehearsed. The proctor placed the printed question in front of him. Elijah took one look, and the floor beneath him seemed to tilt. It wasn't a standard integer proof, not the kind assigned in early competition rounds, not the kind Holden mocked him for, supposedly stumbling through. It was a trap disguised as familiarity, a layered recursive number theory construct, with hidden conditions buried in its phrasing. It was the kind of problem that punished intuition, the kind that mirrored research-level trickery, where one false assumption multiplied into collapse. Even at first glance, Elijah knew this had no place in round 1. He also knew someone had wanted it here. He heard a whisper from the crowd, someone muttering that he was already stuck. His hands rested on the desk, still and steady. Even as his chest burned with a quiet ache, he closed his eyes for a breath, not out of panic but to contain the storm rising inside. He wasn't thinking about integers, or proofs or formal notation. He was thinking about middle school, when a teacher refused to submit his competition form to save him embarrassment. He was thinking about the counselor who assumed his scores were mislabeled. He was thinking about every time excellence had been treated like audacity. The problem in front of him was difficult, but the injustice wrapped around it was familiar. The judge in the center leaned forward. "Competitor, you may begin," she said gently, her tone neutral, almost cautious. The microphone picked up the faint creak of Elijah's chair as he shifted closer to the page. Somewhere in the second row, a spectator whispered that he looked lost. Another student smirked, tapping his foot rhythmically, as if counting down the seconds until humiliation. Elijah exhaled slowly. He began to write. The markers moved across the paper in sharp, swift strokes. But instead of standard step-by-step reasoning, he collapsed the structure inward, dismantling the question's deceptive scaffolding and rebuilding it from a vantage point that bypassed its trap entirely. To anyone watching, it didn't look like logic. It looked like defiance against the expected form. And that was enough for Holden to lean back in his seat, shaking his head with the theatrical disappointment of someone confirming a long-held bias. Holden muttered, louder this time, as though he wanted others to hear, that Elijah was grandstanding, and had no idea what he was doing. The other teacher he spoke to gave a soft, uneasy laugh, not because he agreed, but because contradiction felt dangerous in that moment. The cruelty wasn't loud, it was polite and professional. wrapped in academic tone and measured vocabulary, the kind that hurt more because it pretended to be rational. But something subtle shifted at the judges' table. One of the senior judges furrowed her brow, not at Elijah, but at the question itself. She recognized its origin. Months earlier she had reviewed it as a rejected submission, far too advanced, needlessly convoluted, an exercise in intellectual gatekeeping, rather than assessment. Someone had overridden that decision. Someone had placed it back in rotation. Her gaze flicked toward Halden. In that instant, an unexpected truth threaded quietly through the tension. This wasn't random. This wasn't oversight. It was design. Elijah kept writing, his movements controlled, deliberate, refusing to imitate the textbook pathways others learned to memorize. He didn't annotate or justify as expected. He translated the core of the structure into a compressed conceptual shortcut, something his mind had taught itself to do in lonely hours at his kitchen table, where no one ever told him what acceptable math was supposed to look like. The audience saw speed. The judges saw risk. Halden saw an opportunity to turn confidence into evidence of incompetence. He folded his arms and spoke just loud enough for nearby staff to hear that Elijah didn't respect the process, framing it as disrespect rather than originality. The accusation wasn't about mathematics. It was about belonging. Elijah's intelligence wasn't being tested. His permission to exist in that space was. A flicker of doubt passed through one of the younger competitors waiting backstage. He'd trained with Elijah once, saw firsthand how his reasoning jumped intuitive distances most students never reached. For a brief second, he wondered if the problem wasn't too big for Elijah, but too small to contain him. The thought vanished as quickly as it came. The atmosphere crushed nuance. It was easier to believe the story already unfolding. Elijah paused mid-sentence, his pen hovering above the paper as a realization clicked into place. A hidden constraint buried deep within the phrasing that most solvers would never notice. The auditorium felt colder then, as if every breath carried the weight of the moment. He didn't smile, he didn't react. He simply shifted direction, not to escape the trap but to transform it. From the judges' table, the senior judge's expression tightened. She could see patterns emerging in his work, abstract but intentional, elegant but almost indecipherable to traditional grading rubrics. Her hands clasped together slowly, not in approval yet, but in anticipation. She sensed something happening that was larger than the competition itself. Halden, however, leaned forward and whispered with satisfaction, "He's collapsing his own proof." The comment wasn't about accuracy. It was about narrative. It was about control. The cameras zoomed in. The crowd leaned closer. Every eye followed the arc of Elijah's pen as he filled the final line, his handwriting tightening as if every stroke carried years of exhaustion and quiet resilience. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was trying to survive the moment without letting it define him. He stopped. He placed the pen down, and for the first time since stepping onto the stage, he lifted his head and looked directly at the judges, not pleading, not explaining, simply present, as though daring the room to see past bias long enough to understand what sat on the page. The screen above the stage projected a cropped view of his solution. The audience stared. The judges leaned closer. Halden's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, because what appeared on the monitor wasn't nonsense, but it also wasn't recognizable. It didn't follow any conventional path, didn't mirror any template, didn't resemble the basic integer proof everyone expected to measure him against. It was something else entirely, something no one could immediately read. A hush spread so deeply across the hall that the sound of someone shifting in their seat echoed like a dropped object. The senior judge's eyes sharpened, pulse rising with a feeling she hadn't expected in the first round. Curiosity, because Elijah Carter had not solved the problem the way it was meant to defeat him. He had rewritten it, and in doing so, he had left the entire room unsure whether they were witnessing brilliance or a catastrophic mistake they didn't yet know how to recognize. Elijah scribbles a solution, but no one, including the judges, understands what he's just done. Elijah's footsteps echoed softly as he walked off stage, face unreadable, gaze fixed straight ahead. He didn't search for approval, didn't flinch at the audience's lingering stares, or the buzz of confused whispers building like static behind him. The auditorium didn't erupt in applause or scorn. It sat in limbo, the crowd not knowing whether to celebrate or dismiss what they'd just seen. But in the quiet that followed his performance, one voice sliced through the confusion with unmistakable intent. Mr. Halden chuckled, loud and performative, directing it toward the coach beside him, as though trying to deliver a punchline for the room. "This," he declared, motioning toward Elijah's empty chair, is what happens when we lower standards for diversity points. He didn't solve the problem, he vandalized it. Several students in the back rows laughed, not because it was funny, but because Halden had given them permission. It was the kind of laugh that piggybacks on authority, that seeks cover in numbers, the kind that signals it's safe to mock someone who isn't there to defend himself. Elijah kept walking, his face like stone, but his ears burned with the echo of the word vandalized. Not incorrect, not sloppy, vandalized. It wasn't about the math, it was about character, about intention, about suggesting that Elijah hadn't tried and failed, but had tried to cheat the system, that he didn't belong in the room at all. Back on stage, the host began introducing the next competitor. The competition marched on. Cameras turned. Judges reset their notes. The scoreboard operator moved on to the next name. But one person didn't. Judge Evelyn Romero remained seated. Her brow furrowed, eyes narrowed at Elijah's answer sheet, still lying on the table in front of her. She hadn't moved since he left the podium, and the longer she stared, the more everyone else's laughter began to fade from her consciousness. The other judges had taken quick glances, muttering phrases like unorthodox, too compressed, not formal, but Romero's instincts as a former researcher wouldn't let her look away. Something about the rhythm of Elijah's compressed proof triggered a memory, not of high school math, but of higher-order logic papers she'd reviewed in her postgraduate work. She reached for the paper slowly, almost reverently, as if it might disappear under her fingers. With each line she read, her confusion turned to curiosity, and then to something sharper, recognition. She didn't fully grasp every step at first glance. It was that dense, but she felt the shape of it. The structure wasn't chaotic. It followed a logic she didn't expect, a kind of recursive elegance that only came from someone thinking far outside the standard curriculum. It wasn't wrong. It wasn't gibberish. It was something more dangerous to dismiss. Original. She didn't speak. She didn't correct Halden. Not yet. She simply folded the paper and slid it under her notepad, her fingers gripping it tighter than necessary. As the next competitor took their seat, Romero still hadn't joined the other judges in resetting the rubric. Her mind wasn't on the score sheet. It was on a different kind of metric. The subtle lines between genius and exile, between who gets rewarded for breaking rules and who gets punished for it. She'd seen students like Elijah before, students whose work scared small thinkers into mockery because they couldn't understand it, students who were told they were wrong when they were only unreadable to those with limited vision. Next to her, the junior judge leaned over and said, "We're moving on to combinatorics." Romero didn't answer. Her eyes were still locked on Elijah's symbols. "Judge Romero," he repeated. She blinked, stood up slowly, and whispered, "I'll be back." Before the judge could reply, she turned, paper in hand, and walked out of the judge's box. Her heels clicked across the wooden floor with quiet urgency. The overhead lights caught the edge of the page in her hand, casting a flicker across the audience as she passed. Several people noticed. One of the camera operators instinctively followed her with a wide panning shot, not realizing yet that this unscheduled movement would spark the first wave of internet speculation hours later. Backstage, Holden stood with a few students, pretending not to notice the buzz, but his eyes tracked Romero's every step. When he saw her leave the auditorium with Elijah's paper clutched tightly in her grip, something in his face twitched, a nerve he didn't expect to feel tugged. Not fear exactly, but a disruption of confidence. It lasted only a second before he forced it down. "She'll see it's nonsense," he muttered to no one in particular. "She's just being thorough." But even he didn't believe that fully, because what Halden knew, and hoped no one else remembered, was that the problem Elijah had been given wasn't random. Months ago, Halden himself had lobbied to slip that question into rotation. He'd pitched it under the guise of raising the competition standards, but it had been rejected by Romero specifically for being pedagogically inaccessible. He'd pushed it back in through back channels when she was away at a conference, knowing full well it would trip up most competitors. He wanted to raise the bar so high no one could reach it, especially not someone who in his eyes hadn't earned a place at the table. Now the judge who'd once flagged the question as unfair was walking out with the answer paper that might unravel everything. Inside the viewing area, students whispered. Coaches glanced at one another. A murmur ran through the room as people registered her absence. Even the host paused between announcements, glancing awkwardly toward the empty judge seat. Elijah, seated alone near the end of the competitor row, noticed her departure but didn't flinch. He simply sat still, hands folded in his lap, eyes trained forward like a soldier awaiting either vindication or erasure. He didn't know where she was going, but a sliver of something tightened in his chest. Not hope exactly, but the absence of despair, and that, for him, was already something. Backstage, Holden's phone buzzed. A message flashed across the screen from an unnamed number. "You said the judge would fold. She's leaving with it." Holden's fingers hovered above the screen, motionless. Something had shifted. The judge leaves the room mid-round, holding Elijah's answer tightly. Long before Elijah Carter stood on that stage, under searing lights, long before a judge clutched his paper, like a blueprint to something bigger than the competition itself, he had already been navigating a different kind of math, the arithmetic of survival. In a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the south side of Charlotte, North Carolina, Elijah grew up to the hum of box fans and the clatter of keys as his mother left for one of her 2 jobs before dawn. The place smelled of old floorboards and detergent, and most days the only warm thing in the house was the blue glow of the cheap tablet his mother bought secondhand from a pawn shop. It barely worked. The screen flickered. Half the apps crashed on startup, but to Elijah it was a universe. By the time he was 10, he had already outgrown every worksheet his school provided. While his classmates memorized multiplication tables, he was unraveling Khan Academy videos in the dead of night, teaching himself limits and derivatives with the kind of hunger most kids reserved for video games. There were no tutors, no summer camps, no math clubs. The school district didn't offer gifted programs, no funding, the office said. When his mother tried to advocate for him, they handed her brochures for after-school programs that focused on building confidence rather than content. They didn't believe he needed challenge. They believed he needed discipline. He didn't complain. Not once. Instead, he taught himself trigonometry from a dusty calculus textbook he found in a church donation bin, behind the local library. The pages were water-damaged, warped, and smelled faintly of Madhu. But inside those margins, he found clarity. He scribbled notes on brown grocery bags, solved integrals in the margins of expired bank statements, and built recursive loops on a cracked Chromebook that randomly shut down every 20 minutes. No one noticed. Not really. His teachers acknowledged he was quiet, self-motivated, independent, but the compliments were hollow, and they came laced with suspicion. When he submitted a logic puzzle too advanced for the curriculum, his middle school teacher accused him of plagiarism. When he wrote an original proof for a basic geometry problem, the principal pulled his mother into a meeting and warned about attitude concerns. The message was clear. Even if it wasn't said aloud, he was too confident for someone like him. So Elijah turned inward. He joined forums under anonymous usernames, shared his math solutions on Reddit threads, and posed questions that drew responses from graduate students and teaching assistants who assumed he was one of them. One post, a particularly elegant take on graph theory, went viral in a niche academic sub. Someone commented, "Whoever this kid is, he needs to be at MIT." That was when someone finally noticed. Professor Julian Maris from Wake Forest University had been casually browsing Reddit when he stumbled on Elijah's post. The proof wasn't just smart, it was different, compact, fluid, precise in a way that didn't mimic textbook patterns but reimagined. Maris reached out anonymously, assuming he'd find a precocious college student on the other end. He didn't. He found a 15-year-old boy living in an underserved district, with no access to advanced math. A boy whose internet access came from borrowed Wi-Fi next to a laundromat. A boy who didn't complain about the barriers, only asked if his logic made sense. Maris was stunned. He arranged for Elijah to attend an open forum on campus. It wasn't an official invitation, just a low-stakes symposium where professors discussed research ideas. Elijah's mother took the day off from both her jobs, packed them peanut butter sandwiches in foil, and rode with him for 3 hours by bus. When they arrived, no one looked like them. The halls were filled with polished shoes, monogrammed laptop bags, and conversations laced with words like grants, postdocs, citations. Elijah walked in wearing a thrift store polo and carrying his notes in a reusable grocery bag. At first, the room barely acknowledged him. He sat in the back, listening silently, nodding through unfamiliar terminology, piecing together context with instinct sharpened through years of self-guided study. When the floor opened for questions, he raised his hand once. His voice cracked when he spoke, not out of fear, but from disuse. The room turned toward him with a kind of confusion, then curiosity. His question stopped the discussion cold. It was not only relevant, it highlighted an overlooked edge case in the professor's research. Silence hung. Then, quietly, Professor Maris smiled. "What's your name?" he asked. "Elijah," he said softly. After that, the emails started. Not from the professors. From a judge. Ellen Romero had been on that very panel. Listening. Observing. She hadn't spoken much during the forum, but she'd been watching Elijah, not just that day, but before. She had seen his Reddit posts too. She had traced the writing style, the signature compression of logic, while others commented or scrolled past. She took screenshots. She wasn't just curious, she was protective. She recognized something in Elijah that she hadn't seen since her own early days in academia. Not just raw talent, but dangerous brilliance. The kind that threatens institutions when it doesn't come in the expected form, from the expected families, wearing the expected credential. She had made her own enemies by pushing for educational equity, and she knew what it looked like when talent was gatekept in the name of tradition. But she couldn't reach out directly. Judges were supposed to stay impartial, so she followed quietly, watched him grow, saw the way his posts got sharper, more refined. She saw how other users began to criticize his format. Too obscure, too non-standard, too fast. She knew that tone. She'd lived it. Now inside the hallway of the State Convention Center, clutching Elijah's answer sheet, Romero felt her pulse rising for the first time in years. This wasn't just a math problem anymore. This was a pattern, a system, a bull, and she'd been watching him longer than anyone else in that auditorium. She rounded the corner, pressing the paper to her chest, and whispered under her breath like it was sacred. He's the same kid. The same judge who left the room was the one who secretly monitored his work online. The judge's chamber sat just beyond the main auditorium, a room with thick gray carpet and frosted glass windows that muted the roar of the audience outside. Inside, the silence wasn't peaceful. It pulsed with unease. 5 judges sat around a circular oak table, their eyes fixed on the paper Judge Evelyn Romero had just laid in the center like a detonator. No one spoke at first. The rustle of fabric as one leaned in, the click of a pen cap being flicked nervously open and shut. These were the only sounds cutting through the tension. Romero stood over them, not seated, her arms crossed, expression unreadable. She wasn't there to prove anything. She was there to confirm what she already suspected, that Elijah Carter's scribbled, compressed solution was no accident. It was deliberate, it was precise, and it was unprecedented. Judge Rowland, the eldest among them, and the committee's chair, adjusted his bifocals, and leaned closer to the page. "This doesn't match any of the official rubrics," he muttered, half to himself. "Of course it doesn't," Romero replied. "He didn't follow the rubric, he transcended it." One of the younger judges tilted his head, confused. "You're saying he, what? Invented a new method on the spot?" Romero shook her head slowly. "Not on the spot. This level of thinking doesn't appear overnight. He's been building this structure for years. Quietly, invisibly." The group leaned in, eyes narrowed, as Romero walked them through the proof line by line. What at first looked like compressed symbols and unexplained leaps revealed a tightly woven logic. It avoided traditional pathing entirely. Elijah had, whether intentionally or by instinct, stripped away the pedagogical fluff and constructed a staircase from thin air. One built for minds that didn't need to be told where step. A long pause fell. Then, Rowland exhaled. "You're telling me this student didn't just answer the problem, he rewrote the language we use to solve it." Romero's voice was low. He didn't break the system, he revealed how small it really is. A knock shattered the moment. The door opened sharply before anyone responded. Richard Halden strode in, like a man seizing a scene. His shoes clicked with purpose against the carpet, and his mouth was already in motion before the door shut behind him. "What the hell is going on?" he barked. "I just saw Romero walk out with a contestant's paper in the middle of scoring. That's not protocol." His eyes scanned the table, then they fell on the center sheet. He froze. No one answered immediately. It was Romero who finally broke the silence. "We're reviewing Elijah Carter's solution." Halden let out a short, scoffing laugh. "Reviewing? There's nothing to review. The kid wrote nonsense. He didn't even define variables properly. It's showboating. Nothing more." Rowland didn't look up. "Sit down, Mr. Halden." But Halden didn't sit. He pointed to the page, his voice rising. "This is exactly why competitions like this are losing credibility. We're rewarding spectacle over rigor." He didn't solve the problem. He danced around it. Romero turned toward him. Slowly, her voice was steady. "No, he didn't dance around it. He built a solution so compact and elegant that none of us recognized it at first. and we almost let our assumptions about his background dismiss it. Holden's jaw tightened. You think I care where he's from? I think you care that someone like him didn't ask for your permission to be brilliant. The room tensed. That sentence struck deeper than any accusation of bias ever could, because it named the quiet truth none of them wanted to say aloud. Holden had built his authority not just on knowledge, but on gatekeeping it, and Elijah had walked in without knocking. Holden stepped forward. Even if his answer has merit, he violated the format. The rules require students to show steps in a specific manner. If we make an exception for this, we're not making an exception, Roland said sharply, looking up for the first time. We're acknowledging a revolution. Holden's brow furrowed. Excuse me? Romero stepped closer, holding up the paper. This boy didn't just answer the question. He solved an unsolved problem. The words hung like smoke. The judges all sat back, stunned into stillness. Even Holden blinked, visibly rattled. That problem was pulled from a rejected submission set. It wasn't designed to be unsolved. Romero looked at him squarely. Then someone submitted a problem they didn't fully understand. Holden's lips parted slightly, but no words came. Because deep down, buried beneath layers of ego and years of unchallenged superiority, even he knew, Elijah hadn't guessed. He hadn't performed. He had seen through the system, where others followed a map. Elijah rewrote the terrain. Outside the door, the round's final bell chimed. A wave of applause rose from the auditorium as the next student finished their presentation. But inside the room, time had slowed. Judge Roland reached for the intercom. I'm calling an emergency scoring review. Suspend the next round until further notice. Another judge stood. But the audience, we'll make an announcement. We're correcting an oversight. Romero watched Holden closely. He didn't speak. He didn't move. But in his eyes something cracked. Not panic, not fear, but the sinking realization that everything he built his authority on could now be questioned by a boy in second-hand clothes, armed with nothing but an untamed mind. Holden turned toward the door, his fingers twitching like he was deciding whether to fight harder or vanish quietly. But just as he reached for the handle, Roland added something else. Before you go, we'll need to discuss the origin of that problem. Someone pushed it through after it was flagged. Holden froze. Romero's eyes locked on him. This boy didn't just answer the question, he solved an unsolved problem. The announcement delay from the judges rippled through the auditorium like a fault line. But outside the sealed doors of the review chamber, the world didn't wait for context. It reacted. The clip surfaced first from a shaky phone recording, zoomed in from the balcony, catching Holden's dismissive smirk in the sentence that would ignite a storm. This is what happens when we lower standards. The video lasted only 12 seconds. But in those 12 seconds, tone, posture, and subtext wrapped themselves around Elijah's identity like a noose. Within minutes, the footage leapt from private group chats to public feeds, reshared by a local student who captioned it with 3 chilling words. He said that publicly. By the time Elijah stepped into the side corridor for water, unaware of the digital wildfire, the video had already crossed platforms, stripped of nuance, reframed as spectacle. The comments began as murmurs. A few questioning voices. A few defensive ones. Then they split and multiplied. Suddenly the narrative wasn't about math, or proof, or innovation. It became a referendum on belonging. Threads ballooned overnight, and hashtags like diversity higher, not this math, and lowered standards slithered across timelines like graffiti across walls. Influencers, who had never set foot inside an academic competition, stitched the clip into reaction videos. Radio hosts debated whether merit was being sacrificed for optics. Anonymous avatars with flags in their bios dissected Elijah's face, his posture, his silence on stage, as if quiet confidence were proof of incompetence. They shared screenshots of unrelated statistics about school quota. They speculated about his grades. They used his name like an accusation. Elijah's mother, Stephanie, had been sitting in the lobby near the concession counter when her phone began buzzing repeatedly, notifications piling into a frantic cascade. She didn't recognize most of the numbers or account names, but she recognized the rhythm of crisis, the way strangers suddenly discovered your existence, only to strip it down to an argument. Her chest tightened as she scrolled and saw her son's image under headlines he didn't choose. A local account had tagged her workplace, asking whether taxpayer money funded mediocrity. Her hands trembled. She pressed her palm over her mouth as the screen blurred, then whispered his name like a prayer. She found him seated alone, on a bench near the exit doors, shoulders drawn in, posture still. He wasn't scrolling. He was staring at the floor, jaw locked, as if holding back a tidal wave with his teeth. She sat beside him without speaking at first, her presence a fragile barrier against the chaos pressing in. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but heavy. "Baby," she said, "don't look at it. Don't let them in." Her words carried years of experience. The quiet knowledge that sometimes violence isn't physical, it's linguistic, delivered through pixels and certainty. But Elijah had already looked. He had seen the threads calling him a scholarship experiment, a charity case, a mascot. He had seen strangers rewiring his work into caricature, critics insisting he was handed an opportunity others earned. He had seen a still frame of his face mid-thought, turned into a meme, with captions mocking his intelligence, and beneath all of it, woven through hashtags and clever cruelty, he had seen the thing that hurt most: how quickly a room full of adults had accepted Holden's tone as truth. It wasn't the trolls that gutted him. It was the fact that the clip wasn't distorted. The humiliation had been public from the beginning. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He swallowed, tasted metal in his throat, and said quietly, "They already decided who I'm allowed to be." The sentence didn't tremble. It landed, like a verdict on itself. Meanwhile, in the judge's chamber, the recalculation continued in silence while the online world manufactured conclusions at lightning speed. Romero's hands hovered over the proof, aware that every passing minute widened the gap between Elijah's reality and the version being sculpted for public consumption. She glanced at Roland and murmured, "We're running out of time." He nodded, both of them knowing that fairness delayed was easily rewritten into myth. Outside, reporters who had arrived to cover the academic finals now lingered near the lobby, sensing a story far messier, and therefore far more valuable than a contest scoreboard. Microphones appeared from jackets. Students whispered into them. Someone claimed they'd heard Elijah argue with coaches. Someone else insisted he showed attitude. The absence of facts became a breeding ground for imagination, and imagination in the hands of people unwilling to see him turned cruel. Back home in Charlotte, Elijah's neighbors began sharing the clip. Some defended him fiercely. Church members who remembered the quiet boy tutoring younger kids, co-workers of his mother, who knew how hard she fought to keep doors open for him. But even the supportive messages stung, because they were reactive. They existed only because he had already been dragged into a narrative he didn't write. The praise felt like apology letters written to a wound that hadn't finished forming. Stephanie placed a hand over his phone, her voice firm now. "Don't read another word," she said, her breath trembling with fear disguised as strength. "They do not get to define you." Elijah nodded, but didn't answer, because deep inside he knew something complicated. They didn't get to define his worth, but they could still define his reputation, his opportunities, his safety. Their perception had power, and power left scars. The storm escalated when a mid-tier commentator posted a thread claiming that the only reason Elijah was on the team was because of district initiatives to improve racial optics. He cited nothing. He didn't need to. The allegations slipped perfectly into people's expectations and hardened into certainty. Within hours, screenshots of the thread circulated with the authority of a sourced document. People spoke about Elijah's supposed preferential selection, as if it were established fact, as if the years he spent studying in silence didn't exist at all. In the corridor, a few of the other competitors watched the trending hashtags unfold in real time. One of them whispered uneasily, "This is getting ugly." Another shrugged, saying, "If he couldn't handle the pressure, he shouldn't be here." Their voices weren't venomous, just detached, safe behind privilege, protected by the comfort of being seen as default. But then the twist arrived, not from rumor, not from commentary, but from inside the institution itself. An anonymous account posted a screenshot. It showed a school district email thread. The subject line read, "Team selection concern, Carter." The sender was Richard Halden. The email wasn't loud. It wasn't emotional. It was cold, professional, and devastating. In it, Halden argued that Elijah's unconventional thinking style made him unsuitable for team dynamics, that including him might complicate the perception of rigor, and that placing him on roster for optics could weaken long-term credibility. He hadn't said he doubted Elijah's math. He framed it as preservation of image, of tradition, of hierarchy. The post exploded. The narrative fractured. People who had mocked Elijah now hesitated, sensing the ground shifting beneath them. Others doubled down, insisting the email was fake, a smear. Investigators, journalists, and alumni began requesting verification. Within minutes, a former assistant coach confirmed privately to a student that the email was real, and someone leaked the full thread. The messages revealed something Elijah had suspected but never proven. Halden had tried to block him from joining the team entirely. Not because he lacked ability, but because his ability threatened control. Back in the lobby, Stephanie's phone vibrated again. She opened the message slowly, reading the leaked email in silence, her lips parting as if absorbing a blow she had braced for her entire life. Elijah leaned over, scanning the words that turned suspicion into evidence, each sentence a paper cut along years of restraint. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The truth didn't feel like vindication. It felt like confirmation of a reality he'd been forced to navigate quietly. Brilliance meant nothing if the wrong person refused to see it. And somewhere deep inside the convention center, as the judges prepared to step back into the light and speak for the first time since the review began, the email continued spreading, reshaping the story, re-aiming the lens, dragging the system itself into the spotlight. But the leak didn't just reveal Halden's bias. Buried at the bottom of the thread was a name Elijah never expected to see attached to his defense. A name he recognized. A name that would change everything. A leaked internal email from Mr. Halden reveals he tried to block Elijah from joining the team entirely. 3 days before the state math competition, a dimly lit conference room inside Northridge Academy buzzed with soft conversation and clinking coffee mugs. The walls were lined with laminated posters of past academic champions, most of them white, all of them wearing the school's signature maroon blazer, a quiet gallery of excellence, curated over decades to reflect a very specific kind of prestige. At the center of the long oak table sat the school's selection committee, 4 teachers and 1 administrator, and at the head, with his notes already stacked in perfect symmetry, was Mr. Richard Halden. This wasn't a public meeting. It wasn't on any official school calendar. It was labeled Team Strategy Review, a name vague enough to avoid attention, but deliberate enough to signal its intent. Finalize the math team roster under the pretense of optimizing performance, even though the scores had already spoken. The real goal was influence. Who belonged? Who did? Miss Dana Rayner sat quietly near the far end of the table, a second-year math teacher with short-cropped hair, dark-rimmed glasses, and a habit of listening more than speaking. She joined Northridge with hopes of reforming curriculum, of widening access, of mentoring students who didn't come prepackaged with AP credits and private tutors. But within weeks, she had noticed the soft hierarchy embedded into every conversation. How students of color were praised for effort, while others were praised for brilliance. How committee meetings always circled back to optics, reputation, and legacy. On the table in front of her, tucked just beneath her notebook, her phone rested screen down. It was recording. Halden cleared his throat and began. We're finalizing the 6 students for state. Now, based strictly on the scores, Carter qualified, but we all know context matters. There was no objection. Not yet. Just the faint shuffle of papers. The nods of people who'd already been briefed. He's inconsistent, Halden continued. He thinks in strange ways, skips steps, doesn't follow standard formatting. That might be fine in theory class, but in competition, it's a liability. We need students who reflect structure, not improvisation. Rayner's pen tapped against her pad. Slow, deliberate, a pulse of rising disbelief. She knew Elijah's score. She had proctored one of the rounds herself. He hadn't just qualified. He'd ranked first. An older teacher beside Halden spoke up. He does test well, Richard. And his qualifying solution, that algorithm loop. It was efficient. Halden's smile didn't reach his eyes. Yes, but efficient isn't the same as correct under pressure. These competitions aren't just about the answers. They're about discipline, decorum. Carter doesn't look like the rest of our team. He doesn't present like them. There it was. Rayner's grip tightened on her pen. Let me be frank, Halden said, his voice lowering, as if pretending to show discretion made the statement less damning. He's going to draw attention. Questions. The last thing we need is the committee thinking we've made decisions for appearances. Another teacher chuckled lightly, the kind of chuckle that hid behind phrases like "you're just being honest." Rayner's stomach twisted. Every word that followed layered the bias under the polite language of compatibility, public perception, cohesion. They danced around their discomfort with Elijah's existence in that room, around the truth that what unnerved them wasn't that he might embarrass them, but that he might outshine the ones they'd already decided were worthy. I'm just saying, Halden added, if we want Northridge to keep its edge, we need predictability. Carter doesn't give us that. Frankly, I think he'll make us look desperate. That word, desperate, sliced through the air with more violence than shouting ever could. Rayner stopped taking notes, She pressed the edge of her palm into her phone, making sure the microphone was still uncovered. She didn't trust herself to speak, not yet, because if she did, she might say too much, and she had learned, as all younger teachers learn, that speaking up in the wrong room meant risking everything. The administrator chimed in cautiously. We can't technically disqualify him, not without violating the written criteria. But perhaps, he could be a substitute. Halden nodded quickly, seizing the suggestion. Yes, that would be best. Keep him close enough to avoid backlash, but not on the main roster unless absolutely necessary. It was calculated. Surgical. A decision not to remove him entirely, just to place him where he could be managed, minimized. It was bias disguised as strategy, the institutional kind that couldn't be proved in a single sentence, but unfolded across dozens of them, in tone, timing, and implication. Rayner sat in silence as the meeting ended. The others left with the casual energy of people who believed they had done something responsible, not cruel. She stayed behind, waiting until the door closed, then exhaled the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked up her phone and stopped the recording. She didn't have a plan. Not yet. But something in her refused to let that conversation vanish into silence. That evening, in her apartment, she played the audio again. This time, she listened not as a teacher, but as a witness. The room had been full of professionals, educators, mentors, and not one of them had spoken against what Halden said. Even those who seemed hesitant folded under the weight of his certainty. She opened her laptop and searched her email. 2 weeks earlier, she'd received a message from a freelance journalist named Mira Patel. Patel had been investigating racial disparities in advanced academic tracks and had reached out to Northridge after noticing a decade-long trend. High scores from students of color often didn't translate to equal team representation. She had asked Rayner if she'd ever seen anything questionable. At the time, Rayner had hesitated, not wanting to jeopardize her position. Now she opened the thread and clicked reply. Her message was short. I have something you'll want to hear. Sending over a file. Listen carefully. She attached the audio, titled it neutrally, Internal Strategy Session 311, and hit send. Within minutes she received a read receipt. 10 minutes later, Mira replied with a single line, "This is exactly what I've been looking for." Back at the competition venue, Elijah sat beside his mother, unaware that a teacher who barely knew him had just detonated the narrative from within. His name continued to trend online, swallowed by noise, but somewhere in a different kind of quiet, the kind before exposure. The recording was beginning its path into the world, and in the shadows of digital networks and inboxes, a truth long whispered behind closed doors was finally breaking into the open. Ms. Rayner forwards the recording to a journalist investigating racial bias in school programs. The walls of the competition boardroom felt closer than usual, as though the building itself could sense the tension boiling beneath its polished exterior. A silent war was unfolding, one that had nothing to do with formulas or logic games, but with pride, exposure, and an uncomfortable reality that the system had failed in full view of the nation. Screens across the room blinked with live analytic. Emails poured in faster than the assistants could sort them. Headlines from coast to coast blared variations of the same stunned theme. Student mocked by coach solves unsolved problem. The footage of Halden's recorded meeting was now public. The audio from Ms. Rayner's phone had been played over morning radio, embedded in digital think pieces, and quoted by educational equity advocates. The name Elijah Carter wasn't just trending, it was now shorthand for the conversation America had long delayed. Who gets to be seen as brilliant, and who gets filtered out before brilliance has a chance to breathe. Inside the glass-encased conference center, the committee chair, Dr. Lansing, leaned over the master scoreboard and adjusted his glasses. The digital math never lied. And there, beneath the final recalculation, Elijah Carter's name stood at the top, rank 1, ahead of every prep school prodigy and scholarship-sponsored competitor in the country. His points were not only valid, they exceeded expectation. His solution had been flagged for peer review by a panel of university mathematicians. No algorithm-detected error. No margin of doubt remained. But standing by the window, Richard Halden refused to look at the screen. "I'm telling you," he said, voice clipped, tone restrained by a veneer of civility that was rapidly cracking. "If you validate this result, you're legitimizing an entirely subjective approach to problem solving. You're eroding standards." Dr. Lansing didn't look up. "We're validating the solution because it is mathematically sound. The rest is noise." Halden stepped forward, placing both palms on the table. "You want Northridge to withdraw? Because I'll pull my team. Permanently. A low murmur passed between committee members. The threat wasn't idle. Northridge brought prestige, donors, spectator draw. Halden had crafted a reputation that made him powerful, not just in his district, but nationally. His students were consistently recruited into elite colleges. His influence stretched far beyond the auditorium. But now, the very tool he had used to gatekeep access, prestige, was being turned against him. One board member cleared her throat. You want to pull the team because a student you personally tried to sideline ended up outperforming your selections? Halden's expression hardened. I want consistency. This looks like a stunt. His score doesn't look like a stunt. Romero interjected from the far end. She had been silent until now, but her presence carried new weight. She wasn't just a judge anymore. She was the one who had defended Elijah's paper before anyone else had bothered to read it. It looks like talent you refuse to recognize. Halden turned to her, voice low, cold. You've had it out for me since Zurich. Don't pretend this is about integrity. Romero didn't blink. It's always been about integrity. You just never expected it to count against you. The room fell into a silence so thick it felt like gravity. Halden turned back toward the digital scoreboard, finally letting his eyes meet the name at the top. Elijah Carter, a name he had once buried on a bench, now resurfacing like truth always does. Unexpected, undeniable, and inconvenient. Outside the boardroom, the atmosphere was electric. Students pressed their ears to the doors. Reporters refreshed Twitter feeds. Microphones crowded into security-guarded corners. Hungry for the board's official word, no one cared about the next round anymore. They wanted answers. Not about who won, but about how they almost didn't. Inside, Dr. Lansing turned to his colleagues. We can't ignore the optics, he said carefully. But we also can't let fear of optics distort the math. Carter's score is first. End of discussion. Halden opened his mouth to speak, but Lansing raised a hand before he could. We'll be issuing a public statement. Fine, Halden muttered, backing away, his authority retreating with each step. Lansing continued, louder this time, and not just a press release. A live conference. Today, we'll correct the record. That word, correct, landed with layered weight. Romero leaned in. He deserves to be there when we say it. Lansing paused. Carter? Yes. Romero nodded. This isn't just about numbers anymore. This is about narrative. We let the public paint him as a fraud. Let's show them the truth. With him standing right beside it. Outside, Stephanie Carter's phone buzzed again. This time the number was official. She answered with caution, half expecting another wave of questions or apologies. Instead, she was told that the competition board was hosting a press conference in 20 minutes, and they wanted Elijah to be present. Not as a footnote, not as a victim, as the top scorer. Elijah stood beside her, listening, one hand still gripping the straps of his worn backpack. When the call ended, his voice was quiet. Why now? Stephanie looked at him, eyes full of pride that battled exhaustion. Because the truth got louder than their silence. Down the hall, camera crews began to set up. A podium was wheeled onto the main stage. The audience, still murmuring over the day's events, turned toward the motion with sudden awareness that something bigger was unfolding. Back in the committee room, Halden slipped out, unnoticed by most, except Romero, who watched him go with a gaze that held neither anger nor pity. Just finality. Moments later, an announcement echoed through the loudspeakers. All attendees, please gather in the main auditorium. A press conference regarding competition standings and student recognition will begin shortly. A hush fell. The crowd shifted, and Elijah Carter, still in the same thrifted hoodie, still processing the chaos he never asked for, walked toward the stage, not to answer a question this time, but to stand beside the answer. The board announces a live press conference to address the controversy. Elijah is asked to attend. The room looked different under lights. Not the warm kind that draped over stages during student awards, or the ceremonial glow of year-end galas, but the hard white-hot kind reserved for live networks, lawsuits, and fallouts. Wires snaked across the carpet like veins beneath skin. Boom mics hovered just out of frame. Every camera lens in the auditorium pointed dead center on the long table where the board sat, flanked by competition officials, judges, and two students who couldn't have been more different in posture or story. Elijah sat on the far left, shoulders square, his mother just behind him in the front row. The room felt like it was tilting toward him. Every eye, every flash, every breath waited for him to move, to speak, to read. But he stayed still, composed in the way only someone accustomed to surveillance could manage. He wasn't there for closure. He wasn't even sure what this moment was supposed to give him. He only knew it was no longer about proving himself. It was about revealing what had always been true. Beside him sat Mr. Richard Halden. The contrast between them was cinematic. Halden in his tailored blazer, pale face stiff with rehearsed professionalism, eyes darting to the cameras, to the board, to anywhere but Elijah. The man who once scoffed at Elijah's presence now shared a table with him. Only now the table wasn't a place of authority. It was a reckoning. Dr. Lansing stepped to the podium. His voice was calm, but the gravity in his tone gave it weight. Good afternoon. As many of you are aware, this year's competition has brought with it unprecedented challenges, not due to the quality of the students, but due to the decisions made by those tasked with guiding them. Murmurs rippled across the seats. Reporters leaned forward. Cameras tightened their zooms. Lansing continued. In the interest of transparency, and to honor the students whose work demands integrity, we are releasing footage, documents, and internal communications that have shaped this week's events. He gestured toward the large screen behind him. A click. Then black. Then video. It began with the balcony clip. Halden's dismissive smirk. The lowering standards remark. The laughter from surrounding staff. The room watched in painful silence. Elijah didn't flinch. He'd seen it already, lived it in real time. But here on this stage, the playback was different. It wasn't just a moment. It was evidence. Then came the audio. Rayner's recording. The closed-door meeting. The calm, deliberate phrases about compatibility, presentation, and optics. Halden's voice was unmistakable. He wasn't angry in it. He was confident. That made it work. The audience reacted with staggered gasps. A hand pressed to a mouth here. A head shaking in disbelief there. It was no longer a matter of context. The context had been spoon-fed to them, in Halden's own voice. When the screen faded, the room was hollow with tension. Halden cleared his throat. He hadn't been told they'd play that recording. He looked at the panel, then at the rows of cameras now inches from his every blink. I'd like to clarify, he began, voice tight, that in competitive environments, especially ones of this level, we are constantly assessing not just aptitude, but team dynamics. My remarks, though poorly phrased, were never intended to diminish Elijah's abilities. Lansing raised an eyebrow.
Halden continued. I made misjudgments. I admit that. But my goal has always been to preserve the integrity of the program.
A journalist called out from the back. And what about preserving the student? Halden paused, eyes flashing. But he didn't answer. Instead, Romero leaned toward her mic. Integrity doesn't require suppression. It requires courage. Elijah showed that. This committee didn't. Another board member added quietly. And this institution must own that. Halden turned to Elijah for the first time. His voice lowered, as if trying to personalize the moment. I underestimated you, and I'm sorry. Elijah didn't respond, not out of pettiness, because there was nothing left to accept. A boy who had learned to survive being ignored, had no use for an apology, offered only when cameras arrived. Lansing stepped forward again. Before we close this conference, there is one more matter. He nodded toward the wings of the stage. A pause. Then footsteps. From the side entrance a man emerged, gray hair, dark suit, distinguished gait. Some in the crowd whispered, recognizing him before the announcer could speak. Dr. Adam Perlow, tenured professor of mathematical logic at Columbia University, co-author of multiple published theorems, and academic advisor to several international competitions. The man took the mic with measured calm. I was asked unofficially to review a particular student's submission from this year's opening round. That review, I believed, would be a quiet courtesy. But upon seeing the work, I couldn't remain silent. He held up a copy of Elijah's paper. This, he said, is not just a solution. It is a novel framework, a modular theorem application with recursive minimization that until now has only been proposed in draft theory. Elijah Carter built a blueprint on a competition stage that my peers and I have spent years conceptualizing in theory. Gasps echoed through the room. Perlow wasn't done. As of this morning, I have submitted a formal recommendation to the International Mathematics Journal, requesting Elijah Carter's method be peer-reviewed for publication, not as a student breakthrough, but as a legitimate advancement in the field. A moment of complete silence followed. Then, as if the weight of the entire past week collapsed at once into collective release, the room erupted. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Applause scattered. Uncoordinated. Raw. It wasn't celebration, it was disbelief, awe and fury all tangled into a moment too large to hold quietly. Holden's face drained of color. Romero leaned back in her chair. Elijah remained still. Because brilliance was never new to him. Only now the world had run out of excuses to ignore it. Perlo turned to Elijah directly. You don't need my validation, son. But you deserve to know your work shook the right rooms. And then, just as Lansing prepared to close the conference, a producer gestured frantically from backstage, pressing an earpiece into one of the media directors. A note was passed to the podium. Lansing read it, lips parting slightly, stunned. Then he looked at Elijah. There's someone requesting to speak, he said slowly. She's flown in, unscheduled. She insists she knows Elijah. Elijah's brows furrowed. Lansing stepped aside, uncertain. From the rear entrance, a woman stepped forward. Not a celebrity, not a scholar, a quiet woman, in an oversized blazer, carrying a worn messenger bag, and walking with calm purpose. And when Elijah saw her face, his mouth parted, his spine went rigid, and every question he'd buried surged forward at once, because she wasn't from this competition. She was from his past. A surprise guest walks on stage, an Ivy League professor who analyzed Elijah's paper and has breaking news. The hush that followed the Ivy League professor's announcement wasn't quiet. It was stunned, reverent, electric with a kind of disbelief that felt almost sacred. Elijah Carter had just been publicly named the author of a breakthrough proof by one of the most respected logicians in the academic world. His paper was going to be peer-reviewed for publication, not as a promising student effort, but as a potential contribution to theoretical mathematics. And the world, the very same world that had spent days ridiculing him, had no choice but to stand still and listen. Within minutes, phones buzzed. Tweets exploded. Notifications lit up every official account tied to the event. News anchors in pressed suits stammered through breaking reports on live television. High school students' math solutions stuns academic community. It wasn't just coverage. It was spectacle. And from that spectacle came the inevitable. Elite universities, lining up to claim what they had nearly missed. Harvard sent their offer first, in a formal email dispatched within the hour. A full-ride scholarship, immediate consideration for early admission, and access to their most advanced theoretical math labs. MIT followed. Then Caltech, Stanford. Each tried to outdo the other, not with money. Elijah didn't care about that, but with language. Words like exceptional, rare, unprecedented. The same words institutions had once hesitated to use around boys who looked like him. The crowd inside the auditorium finally erupted. Clapping, standing, even some students cheering. Not for the system, for the student who survived it. Romero watched from the edge of the stage, arms crossed but eyes soft, the slightest crack of a smile betraying her deep satisfaction. Stephanie Carter, seated in the front row, closed her eyes for a long moment, as if giving herself permission to breathe. Beside her, a journalist wiped their eyes without realizing they'd started crying. But Elijah didn't move. He sat at the center of it all. The lights, the applause, the invitations, the headlines, and clenched his fists beneath the table, knuckles white against his dark skin. Because he knew what none of the applause could cover up. This was not reward. This was reaction. The world wasn't celebrating him. It was correcting itself. A correction born not from fairness, but from fear, from exposure, from guilt. They hadn't valued his mind when it was quiet, when it scribbled solutions on worn-out envelopes, when it tried to join quietly through the front door. They valued it now because the cameras were rolling, because a mistake had gone viral, because silence was no longer an option. He stared at the university offers as others might stare at scars. None of these institutions had reached out when his mother called them for outreach programs. None had responded to his emails, attaching proofs he'd written alone in his living room. But now they tripped over each other to own a piece of his brilliance. Holden sat only a few feet away, a ghost of the arrogance he once wore so effortlessly. He hadn't spoken since the professor's announcement. Not a word. The confidence had drained from his posture, replaced by a flat, blank stare, equal parts disbelief and defeat. Elijah didn't look at him, not once. Holden was no longer important. The story had moved past him. Lansing leaned toward his mic. Elijah, we understand you've had a difficult few days. But if there's anything you'd like to say, this moment is yours. The camera swung toward him. Dozens of microphones extended like open hands. The entire room waited. Elijah pushed back from the table slightly. His chair creaked. For a heartbeat, It looked like he was going to speak, but he didn't. He reached into his backpack, an old fraying thing with one strap held together by electrical tape, and pulled out a sealed envelope. It was thick, labeled, already addressed. He stood slowly, walked past the panel, past Halden, past Lansing, and placed the envelope directly in front of the board chair. Dr. Lansing glanced at it, confused. "What is this?" Elijah looked at him, not with anger, not with resentment, but with the steady gaze of someone who had waited a long time to be heard, and now had nothing left to prove. "It's everything I've written since I was 12, he said, his voice calm even. "Every proof, every theorem, every time someone told me it wasn't real math." Romero's hand covered her mouth. Elijah continued. "You didn't just nearly fail to recognize one solution. You nearly buried a decade of work. That envelope? It doesn't belong to me anymore. It belongs to every student who won't get a microphone when it happens to them." Lansing looked at the envelope, suddenly understanding its weight. "You want us to? I want you to read it," Elijah said. "Before you forget again." Then he stepped back from the table, the room frozen in stunned silence. Before anyone could respond, a producer whispered frantically into Lansing's ear. A second update coming in from the Harvard press office. Lansing turned pale. He stood lifting the microphone again. "We've just been informed that Harvard has amended their offer. They've not only extended a full scholarship, they've created a new youth fellowship in Elijah Carter's name for underrepresented students in mathematics, beginning next year." The crowd gasped, but Elijah didn't smile. He sat down, fists unclenched now, but his face unreadable. He didn't care about Harvard's pivot, about the prestige, about having a program named after him. What mattered was that for the first time in his life, they weren't reacting to his pain. They were reacting to his power, and he knew exactly what to do with it. Elijah stands to speak, but instead he pulls out a sealed envelope and hands it to the board chair. The envelope sat heavy on the table, its plain exterior belying the storm it carried within. As Dr. Lansing carefully broke the seal and unfolded the handwritten pages inside, a tense, anticipatory silence filled the auditorium. No one knew what the letter would contain, but they all understood one thing. It wasn't just a letter, it was a reckoning. Lansing glanced at Elijah, who remained expressionless, then began to read aloud, his voice echoing through the room with deliberate gravity. "I wrote this because I knew someday you would say you didn't see it." The sentence landed like a thunderclap. There were no flourishes in Elijah's writing, no dramatics, just truth, raw, precise, and sharpened over years of endurance. He recounted the first time a teacher lowered his score without explanation, how he was told to show more work, only when his answers differed from the standard format, even if they were correct. He described counselors who steered him away from AP classes, warning that he might feel out of place, and teachers who spoke more about his perseverance than his intellect, as if effort was the only lens through which they could praise a boy like him. Each story wasn't loud, but each one cut deeper than the last. These weren't isolated slights. They were part of a pattern, a quiet, persistent campaign of erasure dressed as guidance. Elijah's words didn't call anyone a villain. He simply recorded what was done, what was said, and most painfully, what wasn't. He detailed the day his scholarship recommendation letters mysteriously disappeared from the portal. The counselor smiled when he asked about it and told him, "Sometimes the system eats things, but the system never ate anyone else's letters." Only, he wrote about walking into classrooms where teachers praised white students for original thinking, but called his work sloppy for using the same shortcuts. He wrote about being told to watch his tone when asking questions. He wrote about being benched, not just that week but across his whole academic life. As Lansing read, many in the room shifted uncomfortably. The students in the audience who had laughed along with Halden now avoided eye contact. A few teachers looked like they wanted to disappear, and Stephanie Carter, sitting in the front row, gripped her chair with trembling fingers. She had lived through every one of those moments, watching her son carry the weight of them in silence. Now they were no longer hidden. Elijah's tone shifted midway through the letter from recounting to something colder, stronger. He wrote not with bitterness but clarity. "You taught me that brilliance only matters when it comes from the right face. You called me difficult when I was accurate, arrogant when I was confident, disrespectful when I was precise." Romero stared at the floor, her arms folded tight. She had fought her own version of this battle years ago, and hearing Elijah say the words she'd once swallowed felt like a wound reopening and healing at the same time. Lansing's voice wavered as he read on. "Every door I knocked on was called an opportunity, but you only opened it when you were afraid of the sound. The line hung in the air, like smoke, curling around the audience's conscience. Elijah's letter laid bare what no headline could fully capture: the exhaustion of being brilliant in a world that only believed it when forced to. He described the feeling of sitting behind teammates he'd outscored, of hearing his coach mock him in the hallway, of watching the same students who once dismissed him now scramble to stand beside him after his proof went viral. But he didn't celebrate their sudden attention. He dismantled it. If my proof had been ordinary, you would have ignored it. If it had been incomplete, you would have mocked it. But because it embarrassed you, now it's brilliance. Now I'm a symbol. Now you want me. By now the room had turned into a courtroom without verdicts. The crowd wasn't moving. They weren't even blinking. They were listening, not just to Elijah's voice through Lansing's lips, but to the silence that followed each truth. And then came the final paragraph, where Elijah's tone grew steady, defiant, and undeniably powerful. I did not become extraordinary because of your doubt. I became extraordinary in spite of your permission. If you only celebrate me when my work embarrasses you, then my success does not free me. It exposes you. When Lansing's voice finally stopped, the only sound in the room was the distant hum of the cameras still rolling. No applause, no gasps, just the weight of the letter anchoring every soul in place. Halden, who had sat rigid during the reading, suddenly shifted. He stood slowly, as if preparing to exit before questions could be asked, before the weight of accountability could fully crash down. His face was pale, jaw locked, fingers twitching. This wasn't the walk of a man leaving in protest. It was the escape of a man undone. But as he turned toward the aisle, he stopped. A group of students, 4 of them, stood in a line just ahead, directly in his path. They didn't shout. They didn't raise their fists. They didn't speak. They just stood, blocking him. Their presence wasn't violent. It was corrective. It was the same silence Elijah had written about, only now, it didn't serve the institution. It served resistance. It served memory. Halden looked from one student to the next, waiting for them to step aside. They didn't. His authority, once absolute in every hallway of North Ridge, meant nothing here. And the room, still holding its breath, watched as a man who had silenced so many with subtle cruelty, was now finally forced to stand still in the face of quiet, collective truth. Mr. Halden tries to walk out, but a group of students block his path. The air in the auditorium never fully settled after the students blocked Halden's exit. The moment lingered like static, a shift nobody planned yet, everybody felt. The image traveled faster than any official statement ever could. A single still frame, a disgraced educator halted by the quiet defiance of his own students, flooded online spaces, printed across headlines, reshared with captions that no longer debated Elijah's worth, but the system that had spent years containing it. And for the first time, the conversation moved beyond one school, one coach, one incident. It became a mirror. Within 24 hours, hallways across the state, filled with a sound administrators had never feared before. Nothing. Desks empty, doors open, corridors lined with backpacks and folded protest flyers. Students didn't shout. They didn't vandalize. They walked out together, rows of bodies moving toward school lawns and public sidewalks, standing in long, unbroken lines that made their absence louder than any chant. At Northridge, the first wave gathered under the same maroon banner. Halden once used to represent excellence. Now it hung behind students who held handwritten placards that read not slogans but stories. Dates when counselors lost transcripts. Test comments marked attitude flagged. Notes about meetings held without them present. Each cardboard sign was a sentence from Elijah's letter that no one could dismiss as exaggeration anymore. Across the street, teachers watched from faculty windows, some ashamed, some defensive, others quietly relieved that the truth had finally released itself from whispers. The walkout spread the way injustice always travels, not by argument, but recognition. Schools in neighboring districts joined next, then rural campuses, magnet academies, even private institutions built on polished histories and unspoken hierarchies. What began as solidarity became revelation. Students shared screenshots of grading rubrics, adjusted downward only on certain names. Others revealed messages discouraging them from applying to advanced tracks for comfort reasons. The phrase circulated so widely that journalists began cataloging its use, like a repeated equation with the same cruel outcome. Elijah watched all of it unfold from the uneasy distance of someone suddenly turned into symbol. Reporters emailed, panels invited him, commentators asked whether he accepted the role people had placed on him. He didn't feel like a leader. He felt like evidence. His mother tried to shield him from the noise, but the world no longer spoke in private. Some praised him as courageous, as a catalyst, as the mind that cracked open a system. Others accused him of dividing schools, of politicizing excellence, of making authority uncomfortable for attention. Opinion columns framed him as phenomenon or threat, depending on who was writing. Strangers debated his humanity and language clinical enough to make wounds feel academic. Elijah endured it all with the quiet restraint he had grown up mastering, the ability to remain still while the world measured him in ways he never consented to. Yet something different pulsed beneath the chaos now, movement with direction. Student coalitions formed with startling coordination, not born from outrage alone, but precision. They demanded independent audits of class placements, transparent scoring policies, training that didn't rebrand bias as professionalism. They asked for resignations not as spectacle, but as accountability. Their petitions read less like protests and more like ledgers, documenting patterns too consistent to deny. Administrators scrambled into emergency conferences. Legal teams drafted statements centered on review and reflection, but nothing they circulated traveled the way the walkouts did. Those lines of students standing in silence became the language everyone understood. Elijah never asked to lead them. And yet, they kept invoking his name, not as a chant, but as a question hovering in every meeting. How many Elijah Carters never reached the stage? He became a reluctant figurehead, a quiet fulcrum around which a conversation finally tipped. He received message after message from students he had never met, each one offering gratitude, grief, or uneasy admiration. Some wrote that they wished they had spoken sooner. Others confessed they never noticed until now. He read each note with the sobering awareness that history had trained too many to see injustice, only after brilliance forced its presence into the room. News crews followed the walkouts as if tracking weather systems. The coverage oscillated between sympathy and suspicion, amplifying praise and backlash in equal measure. Elijah was invited to interviews where hosts framed him as either an icon of change or a cautionary tale of disruption. He answered sparingly, refusing to let the conversation flatten into personal mythology. He spoke about structure, about how harm can exist without incident reports, about how humiliation doesn't always shout. Sometimes it signs paperwork and schedules meeting. He spoke in the same measured tone he used in proofs, precise, deliberate, unmistakable. But even as movement surged forward, resistance emerged at the margins. Commentators accused students of exaggeration, of manipulating narrative, of chasing attention. Alumni circulated letters defending tradition. Some teachers framed the walkouts as emotional rather than structural, hoping to file the moment under youth expression instead of systemic examination. Elijah recognized the pattern immediately, the attempt to recategorize pain until it lost its urgency. Yet this time, the students did not retreat. They stayed on sidewalks, they stayed in press statements, they stayed visible in numbers, so steady that dismissal sounded hollow where it had once sounded authoritative. The board at Northridge convened a special hearing. Holden did not speak. He no longer needed to. The students' presence did all the talking. When the meeting concluded with formal investigations, policy audits and temporary suspensions, no one cheered. This wasn't victory. It was acknowledgement. The cautious first step institutions take when they realize denial has outlived its usefulness. Elijah walked home that evening beneath an amber sky, the city subdued, the world both louder and quieter than before. He wasn't triumphant. He was tired in a way that settled deep into his bones, the fatigue of someone watching truth finally break free, and understanding that freedom always arrives with cost. He sat at his kitchen table later that night, laptop open, offering responses to students who had written long paragraphs about their schools, their counselors, their own smaller humiliations. Some messages felt like mirrors, others like cautionary letters from futures he wouldn't live to see. One thread in particular stayed on his screen longer than the rest. A message that didn't congratulate him, didn't rally, didn't echo the movement's language. It was brief, hesitant, almost frightened. It came from a student in another district, one Elijah had never heard of, a school that rarely appeared in competition rankings or academic showcases. The message began with an admission that they had watched everything unfold quietly from the sidelines, unsure whether speaking would change anything, or simply make things worse. Then, after a pause that lingered across the screen like a held breath, the student wrote that they had something Elijah needed to see. Attached beneath the text was a video file. The preview image showed a classroom corner, a teacher's shadow, a student seated alone. Elijah hovered his finger over the trackpad, pulse slow, the room around him suddenly narrowing to the glow of the screen. He already knew before he opened it, before sound or movement revealed anything, that the story wasn't isolated, that the walkouts hadn't emerged from sympathy, but recognition, repetition, recurrence. He knew because sometimes, injustice doesn't end when exposed. Sometimes, it answers back. He clicked the file. The screen flickered, and what played next didn't just resemble his own experience. It threatened to widen the fault line that had only just begun to crack open. A student at another school contacts Elijah with a shocking video of similar abuse. The video began with the low whir of a projector fan and the muffled sounds of chairs scraping linoleum. At first glance, it could have been any high school classroom on a quiet afternoon, the kind where nothing remarkable happens and everything toxic gets buried under routine. But then the frame shifted, and a student's face came into view. Brown-skinned, hunched slightly, eyes downcast. A teacher's voice filled the audio, not yelling, but laced with a cold authority that didn't need volume to wound. That's not how people like you solve problems. Stick to what you know. The class stayed silent. No one intervened. The teacher moved on like nothing had happened. Elijah watched, expressionless, as the clip continued. In less than 2 minutes, the video revealed a sequence of comments, microaggressions, grading discrepancies, all captured on a hidden phone camera, strung together like a damning montage of normalized cruelty. The student who had sent it remained anonymous, but their caption was short and unmistakable. He transferred to our school last year, same tone, same playbook, same name, Halden. Elijah's chest tightened. It wasn't just about him. It never was. The quiet humiliation he had been subjected to wasn't an isolated flaw in Halden's behavior. It was a system, a pattern replicated and refined across schools and semesters. Within hours of the video going live, former students began coming forward, their stories slipping into comment threads, DM requests, and forum posts like puzzle pieces that finally had a place to belong. One former student posted screenshots of old report cards, where her math grade had inexplicably dropped from a 93 to an 81 after she challenged Halden on an incorrect solution. Another shared an email chain, where a requested recommendation letter got lost right after she was named as one of the only black applicants to a prestigious summer institute. One by one, their testimonies merged into a storm. These weren't grievances, they were data points, and data doesn't lie. The district couldn't ignore it. Not anymore. News broke before lunchtime. Richard Halden had been suspended pending a full investigation. The announcement was brisk, impersonal, just a 2-paragraph press release sent to local media and posted to the district website. But its impact was seismic. For students who had long whispered about favoritism, it was confirmation. For teachers who had stood beside Halden without question, it was a rupture. For Elijah, it was something else entirely, a deep, unsettling stillness. He didn't cheer. He didn't smile. He sat on the edge of his bed, phone buzzing endlessly beside him, and stared at the ceiling with the look of someone who had just watched a house collapse and realized he'd been standing inside it for years. His mother entered quietly, her face lit with the cautious relief of someone who had fought too many battles to celebrate a single win. "You saw the news?" she asked softly. Elijah nodded. "Yeah." Stephanie sat beside him. "It's not just about him anymore, baby." "I know," Elijah said. His voice was flat, not empty but heavy, like someone measuring every word against all the years he hadn't been believed. "But if it took this much to suspend one man, imagine how many are still doing worse in schools that don't have cameras." Stephanie didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her silence wasn't agreement or dismissal. It was a kind of grief only mothers of black sons know how to carry. In the days that followed, Elijah's inbox flooded. Students across the country wrote to thank him for showing what institutional harm looked like when it was recorded and explained. A college dean sent a message saying he had reevaluated his department's approach to admissions criteria. A math curriculum coordinator asked Elijah if he'd be open to consulting on new equity-driven grading guidelines. These were victories. No one could deny that. But for Elijah, each new message felt like an IOU written too late. One night, while reviewing a stack of unsigned recommendation requests he'd been asked to endorse for underrepresented students, Elijah received an email marked confidential, private invite, in his spam folder. The sender IMU, Secretariats, International Mathematics Union. At first he thought it was spam, the kind of thing that gets blasted to inboxes with broken formatting and bold claims. But the signature was legitimate. The seal matched, and the letter inside wasn't just an invitation. It was a once-in-a-generation offer. Elijah had been formally invited to present his solution, the very one Halden mocked in front of an auditorium, as a special feature at the upcoming Global Youth Innovation Summit in Zurich, Switzerland. His paper had already passed preliminary review. A panel of international researchers had voted unanimously to feature him in a main session alongside doctoral candidates and published scholars. But it was the last paragraph that made his breath catch. The board also wishes to acknowledge that your original method has prompted new inquiry across our member institutions. We believe your insight could mark a shift in how early-stage math education approaches structural proofs. If you are willing, we would like to discuss further collaboration on designing new curriculum modules, inspired by your work. He read the line twice. Then again, this wasn't a scholarship. It wasn't a medal. It wasn't even redemption. It was respect extended, not because a system was embarrassed, but because minds across the world saw him for what he had always been. A thinker, not a statistic, not a statement, not a controversy. Elijah turned the laptop toward his mother, who leaned in, squinting at the screen. Her mouth parted as she read, then slowly curved into a look he had never seen before. Not pride exactly, but witnessing. The realization that everything she had once feared he'd be denied was now reaching for him in the language of opportunity. "You're going," she whispered. Elijah nodded, but not with excitement. With purpose. "I'm not just presenting," he said. "I'm rewriting the narrative they tried to bury me under." The International Mathematics Union contacts Elijah with an invitation that could change his life. The sky above Zurich stretched wide and pale, washed in early morning light that made the city's glass facades shimmer like distant lakes. Elijah stood at the edge of the conference hall balcony, overlooking the slow curve of the river below, his breath fogging briefly against the cold. Inside, the International Mathematics Union's Global Youth Innovation Summit pulsed with bright lanyards, polished accents, and conversations in languages he'd only ever read in journals. Scholars moved through the atrium in quiet currents, professors whose names had appeared on paper he used to study on library computers, researchers who had shaped fields he'd learned to navigate alone at his kitchen table. Yet as he stood there pressing his hand against the cool railing, he felt no awe, no intimidation, only a grounded stillness, the certainty that he had arrived not as a guest, but as a voice finally unmuted. The hall that hosted the summit was cavernous and breathtaking. Its ceiling arched in sweeping curves, its lighting soft yet commanding. When Elijah walked down the aisle toward the stage, every head turned with a curiosity that carried none of the skepticism he'd grown used to back home. There were no whispers about whether he belonged, no glances at his clothes, no soft-voiced warnings about tone or format. Here the only thing that mattered was the work, and the work had already traveled ahead of him, spoken in his language even when others once refused to hear it. The moderator introduced him with a reverence that felt almost unreal. They spoke of his theorem not as a lucky anomaly, but as a structural contribution, a bridge between compressed symbolic proof and recursive logic rarely attempted at a pre-doctoral level. Elijah stepped to the lectern, his hands resting lightly along its edge, eyes gliding across the room of scholars waiting not to test him, but to learn from him. He didn't perform. He didn't dramatize. He walked through the theorem the way he had built it, patiently, precisely, as if guiding the audience through a house he'd constructed in darkness long before anyone believed there was a foundation. The slides displayed compact notation, layered reasoning, subtle inversions of structure that revealed solutions most problem sets never dared to approach. Professors leaned forward in their seats, pens hovering mid-sentence, their amazement unguarded. More than once, a ripple of murmured admiration passed through the room, the sound of minds confronted not with novelty for novelty's sake, but with truth rearranged into possibility. When Elijah concluded his presentation, there was no immediate applause. There was silence, full, rich, reverent. Then, as if the room exhaled at once, every chair rose to standing. The applause didn't burst, it swelled, the sound layered and sustained, a wave of recognition he had never been granted at home. Some professors wiped their eyes discreetly. Others nodded toward him with solemn gratitude, and for a fleeting second, Elijah allowed himself to feel it. Not vindication, but alignment, as if the world had finally caught up to the distance he'd already traveled. Later that evening, during the closing ceremony, his name was called again, this time under a new banner. The Global Youth Innovation Award, a medal suspended on a deep blue ribbon, engraved with a date, and a promise he knew he would carry, long after the cameras dimmed. As he accepted the award, the hall erupted once more into applause, but Elijah's expression remained calm, grounded, almost pensive, as though he understood that the weight around his neck was not a trophy, but a responsibility. When he stepped to the microphone, the room leaned forward, anticipating talk of theory, structure, and proof. But Elijah didn't speak about mathematics. He spoke about silence. He spoke about the classrooms where brilliance was graded as defiance, about meetings where decisions were framed as strategy, but rooted in erasure, about the difference between being celebrated and being permitted. His voice remained steady, not angry, not pleading, but painfully honest, shaped by years of being required to prove what others were simply assumed to possess. He spoke of the students who never reached his stage, whose letters vanished quietly from files, whose work was rewritten into mediocrity before it had a chance to breathe. He spoke of how systems do not always crush through force. Sometimes they smother by invisibility. He did not mention names. He did not tell stories to wound. He told them to remember. The room did not applaud between sentences. They listened, because for those few minutes, the summit wasn't a celebration of discovery. It was a confession. At the end of his speech, Elijah paused, then said softly, "If the world only values brilliance after it survives damage, then our institutions do not nurture intelligence. They survive." The line did not break the room open. It settled into it, like a weight placed gently where denial once sat. The applause that followed was different, not triumphant, humbled. After the ceremony, scholars lined up to meet him, not with flattery, but with gratitude. A professor from Ghana told him his work would shift how students back home were taught formal structuring. A mathematician from Poland shook his hand and whispered that Elijah's persistence reminded him why he still believed in the discipline. Even the summit chair thanked him not only for the theorem, but for the truth that came with it. Elijah accepted each word with quiet composure, aware that praise was never the goal, only clarity. When the hall finally emptied, he stepped off the side of the stage, metal warm against his chest, program booklet tucked under his arm. His footsteps echoed softly down the backstage corridor, the hum of the audience fading into distant murmurs behind him. For the first time all day, the atmosphere felt still, almost peaceful, as if the building itself had released something heavy. He turned a corner and stopped. A conference staff member stood there, hesitant, clutching a folded paper in both hands. Her expression carried the awkward weight of someone delivering a message that did not belong in the grandeur of a global summit. "Mr. Carter," she said quietly, her voice careful, respectful. "Someone asked me to give this to you. They said it was from a former teacher." Elijah didn't reach for it at first. The staffer swallowed, then added gently, "He said you would understand why he couldn't come in person." She placed the paper into Elijah's hand. On the back, written in small, unmistakable handwriting, was a name he had not spoken aloud since the day the system finally admitted what it had done to him. Richard Halden. Elijah stared at the folded note for a long moment, the corridor narrowing around him, the echoes of applause still lingering faintly in the distance. He didn't open it, not yet, because sometimes closure doesn't arrive when truth is spoken on a stage. Sometimes it waits quietly in a hallway, dressed in handwriting that once tried to erase you. And as he stood there beneath the soft backstage lights, he knew that whatever waited inside that message wasn't apology, it was consequence. As he steps off stage, someone stops him with a message from Mr. Halden. The corridor lights above him buzzed quietly as Elijah unfolded the thin slip of paper handed to him backstage. A message from Richard Halden, written in a hesitant scrawl that seemed too small for the weight it carried. There were no excuses, no defenses, only 4 simple words. "Tell him I'm sorry. I was wrong." For a moment, Elijah just stood there, the note trembling slightly in his fingers. The world outside was still humming with acceptance, accolades, and scholarly invitations, but this small square of paper carried something older than achievement or shame. It carried acknowledgement, admission, an attempt at redemption from a man who had once weaponized language to diminish him. Halden's apology was quiet, almost humbled, like a confession in a church where no one knew how to pray anymore. But Elijah didn't respond. Not with words, not with gratitude, not with forgiveness, at least not yet. Instead, he folded the paper, tucked it into his notebook, and walked out of the Zurich summit, not back into fame, but into clarity. The applause, the awards, the global recognition, they had been remarkable, but they were not the end of his story. They were merely context. He needed real impact. Back home in Charlotte, Elijah didn't rush into college. He didn't sign up for a celebrity lecture series. He didn't even unpack most of his Zurich luggage. Within weeks of returning, he rented a small room above an old community center, a space that smelled like chalk dust and possibility. He put up a sign that read "Free tutoring for curious minds," no qualifications listed, no fee, no prerequisite. Word spread slowly at first. A few students from the neighborhood, then more from nearby schools, then whispers among parents who drove their children down the side street after school. Elijah stood in front of a whiteboard every afternoon, marker in hand, guiding students through algebraic structures, proofs, logic chains, but also through something deeper, how to hold space for brilliance that wasn't always seen at first glance. His voice was patient, his explanations vivid, and his expectations high, not because he wanted to prove something to them, but because he wanted them to see something within themselves they had been taught to overlook. Parents stood at the door, watching their children nod in comprehension, a mix of surprise and pride flickering across their faces. Students who once flinched under the glare of corrected mistakes now asked questions without fear of judgment. Some came with backpacks stuffed with discarded tests, asking Elijah to show them where they went wrong. He didn't just point out errors, he traced patterns of thought with them, demystifying assumptions and turning confusion into clarity. And slowly the room filled, not just with equations but with laughter, frustration, encouragement, breakthroughs. Teachers in neighboring districts began referring students who needed more than a syllabus, not for remediation, but for affirmation. Counselors, once unsure how to advise bright but unrecognized minds, brought their promising pupils to Elijah's sessions, and every week, his small group grew. Black students, brown students, students from homes where resources were scarce but curiosities were abundant. What started as a simple outreach became a steady current of young people seeking intellectual nurture without judgment. Meanwhile, the ripples of his Zurich speech, his letter, his walkout, and his advocacy continued to spread. School boards in at least 3 states introduced pilot programs, demanding transparent grading policies. Parent-teacher associations hosted discussions about bias in evaluations. Curriculum developers proposed frameworks that accounted for diverse thinking styles rather than penalized them. International educators cited Elijah's work as an example of talent unconfined by tradition. Talent that demanded equity, not just excellence. But Elijah himself remained humble. His tutoring space was not a monument to his success. It was a workshop of possibility. A classroom where failure wasn't a label, but a step toward understanding. And he never mentioned Halden's name again. Not to students, not to parents, not in interviews. The apology letter remained tucked in a drawer somewhere beneath his notebooks, a reminder that recognition sometimes arrives too late for the wound it was meant to heal. That quiet resolve became part of his reputation too. The boy who could have built accolades, and silence instead chose to build community and voice. People told stories about him not as a prodigy who conquered math, but as an advocate who reimagined learning itself. He was invited to speak at educational panels, not to take credit, but to help others listen, truly listen, to minds that education often overlooked. City officials praised his tutoring center as a catalyst for community growth. Foundations offered grants. Some even suggested he start his own school. But Elijah would only agree to one thing: free, unfettered access for students who were brilliant before anyone noticed. Tuition would always be zero. Eligibility would never depend on test scores. Curiosity, he said simply, was enough. And so the tutoring sessions became a quiet movement, intentional but uncelebrated, revolutionary but rooted in ordinary afternoons, where young voices bent over problems with renewed confidence. Homework was no longer a source of dread. It became dialogue. It became opportunity. It became shared victory. One late afternoon, as a golden sun slanted through the dusty windows, Elijah was erasing a board full of quadratic proofs when the door creaked open. A pause, the kind that felt like the world inhaling, and a figure appeared in the doorway. A boy, slightly rumpled, late afternoon light outlining his silhouette. He stepped in slowly, clutching something in his hand. Elijah noticed before the boy spoke. It was a piece of paper, folded carefully, deliberately, like a relic, like a scripture. The boy approached, eyes wide with tentative hope. And as he lifted the paper toward Elijah, the room, already rich with possibility, held its breath once more. A new student walks in late to tutoring. He's carrying Elijah's original competition paper, folded neatly, like scripture. If you believe no student should have to prove their worth just to be treated with dignity, type yes in the comments. What would you do if someone like Elijah was silenced at your school? Subscribe for more true stories that challenge the systems we've been told are fair. Because change doesn't start with applause, it starts with who we choose to stand up for.